black woman in seat 2 amperes didn't belong, or so the cabin made her feel. Dressed, no designer labels, no diamonds flashing under the cabin lights. She sat in business class, yes, but drew only cold stares, raised brows, and a silence too pointed to be polite. No one said it aloud, but it was in the air, thick and cutting. What's she doing here? No one offered a smile. Not the attendant, not the man beside her. But Marion Rice didn't shift. She didn't shrink. Because she'd lived this moment before in airports, boardrooms, whole cities. They didn't know her name yet, but they would. And by the end of this flight, so would the world. She boarded the plane like anyone else. No red carpet, no name badge, no flash of importance. Just a woman in a soft gray cardigan and black flats, clutching a worn leather journal and a boarding pass that read 2 amperes. No one gave her a second glance. That was the point. That was the trap. The flight attendant barely looked at her, eyes scanning over Marion Rice like she was background noise. The woman next to her, in a pearl blazer and too much perfume, offered a polite smile before quickly turning away. The overhead bins clicked shut. The engines began to hum. And no one, not a single soul in that business class cabin, knew that the woman in 2 amperes owned the wings they were flying on. Marion Rice, 52, co-founder and current CEO of Skylift Airways, was returning to the skies she once walked in a navy blue uniform. 25 years ago, she had poured drinks in turbulence, cleaned up after careless passengers, and been called sweetheart and honey far more often than her name. She had been ignored, overlooked, and on more than one occasion spoken to as if her presence in the air was a favor, not a role earned. Today, she wasn't here to be seen. She was here to see. She had quietly arranged this internal flight check without notice, no PRT, no corporate staff trailing her down the aisle. Just Marion, under the radar, watching how her airline treated people, especially those who didn't look like they belonged in first class. And already, the signs were there. The flight attendant poured champagne into tall glasses, laughing easily with the man in 2C. She skipped Marion entirely. Not an oversight, a choice. Marion didn't say a word. She didn't shift in her seat or glance around for an ally. She simply opened her journal, clicked her pen, and wrote one line. Still happening. The plane hadn't even taken off. Outside, the tarmac glowed with late afternoon light, golden and harmless. Inside, something colder took shape. Marion's silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. She knew how people revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching. She had built an empire by learning when to speak and when to listen. But what no one on that plane knew, what the flight attendant would soon regret not asking, was that the woman in seat 2 amperes didn't just sign paychecks. She signed policies, she signed terminations, and sometimes she rewrote the rules entirely. So when that moment came, when the tone crossed the line and the mask slipped, what would Marion do? Let it slide, rise to meet it, or shift the entire cabin with just a few quiet, undeniable truths? The seatbelt sign lit up. The engines roared, and as Skylift 182 lifted into the sky, one thing was sure. The woman they overlooked was the one they should have feared the most. It didn't take long for the first crack to show. Kendra moved down the aisle with the poise of someone who believed she owned the air between rows. Blonde, crisp, impossibly sure of herself. She had the kind of smile that changed depending on who was watching. To the man in 2B gray suit, gold cufflinks, she beamed. "Welcome aboard, sir. Can I take your coat?" Her voice lilted like a melody rehearsed 100 times. She reached Marion next. Her smile dimmed. No, vanished. Her eyes flicked over Marion's outfit. A soft cardigan, low heels, a plain notebook in her lap. No pearls, no status markers. And, above all, the skin she wore. "Lady," Kendra said, flatly. "No, ma'am. No, welcome." Just a word that barely passed for acknowledgement, dropped like a stone between them. Marion looked up slowly, not in confrontation, in recognition. She'd seen this act before. Kendra didn't wait for a reply. She turned her back before Marion could answer if she'd intended to at all. The chill wasn't in the air. It was in the deliberate shift of tone. the practiced invisibility. Marion, the only black woman in business class, had become background noise in a cabin designed for polished greetings and champagne flutes. The man beside her received both. Marion, silence, and a smile withheld. Kendra came back with the drink cart. "Champagne, sir?" she asked the man in 2B again, with just enough warmth to make him smile. She placed his glass with care and adjusted his napkin. Marion watched. When the cart reached her, Kendra did not ask. She placed a lukewarm coffee on Marion's tray table like she was completing a chore. No sugar, no stirrer, no eye contact. No mistake. It wasn't the kind of insult that made headlines. It was smaller, sharper, the kind that slips past witnesses and sinks into your ribs. Measured, chosen, rehearsed. The type of slight that whispers, "You don't belong here," without ever needing to say the words. Marion didn't drink the coffee. She opened her journal instead and wrote 3 words. Same sky, same story. Across the aisle, a woman in pearls paused mid-sip. The man in 3C stole a glance. They'd seen it too, but no one said a word. That's how this worked. Everyone felt it. No one named it. Kendra moved on, laughing 2 rows up with a banker in loafers. Marion could hear her voice again, warm and generous. It struck her how quickly hospitality could be turned on or off, like a faucet, and how often it ran dry for people who looked like her. But Marion didn't shift in her seat, didn't clear her throat, didn't demand respect, because she already knew what Kendra didn't. She wasn't here to be served. She was here to decide who stayed in the sky and who fell from it. And that decision was coming sooner than anyone thought. She didn't flinch. Not when the sir in the seat beside her was offered a warm towel and a glass of wine with a gracious nod. Not when Kendra's tone shifted from bright and polished to cold and transactional the moment their eyes met. Marion Rice sat still. Her expression didn't crack. But beneath that stillness was something vast. Not fury, not defeat. Just the kind of silence born from repetition. The kind that wears grooves into your soul. She'd seen this before. Not once, not twice, hundreds of times. Across counters, at hotel check-ins, in boardrooms where her title was doubted before her resume was read. It didn't matter how far she had climbed. Some people only ever saw the ground she'd walked on, not the heights she'd reached. With a breath so subtle it could have been a sigh, Marion reached into her tote and pulled out a small notebook, soft leather cover, pages filled with the unsaid. She placed it on the tray table as if it were an old friend. She opened it slowly, pen clicking with finality. She didn't rush. This wasn't impulsive. This was routine. She began to write. A few lines, clean, unemotional. A document, not a diary. Still invisible, still waiting, still not enough. She paused, not because she ran out of words, but because the moment didn't need more. She closed the notebook and rested her hand on top of it, her fingers gently curved as though protecting something sacred. She stared straight ahead, composed, unmoved. To the casual observer, she looked like any tired passenger lost in thought. But for those watching closely, and there were a few, something about her presence made them uneasy. A woman so calm, so contained, it almost felt like she was measuring the air. The man in 3C, mid-sip of his wine, glanced her way, then quickly looked down. The woman across the aisle blinked twice, suddenly aware of the tension but unsure where it had come from. The flight attendant had continued her dance of selective courtesy, joking with passengers in suits, over-smiling at certain faces but avoiding Marion's row like a cold spot in the cabin. Marion didn't follow her with her eyes. She didn't need to. She'd already taken note, not just of Kendra's choices, but of the silence that made them acceptable, the look-away culture, the too polite to intervene etiquette of the privileged. And that's what gripped the audience as they watched this story unfold. Not just the rudeness, but the stillness that followed, because in that stillness lived recognition, familiarity, the ache of knowing how many times people like Marion have had to be the adult in the room, the one who absorbs the slight so the moment doesn't escalate. But this moment would not fade, because unlike others before it, this one had witnesses. Not just in seat 2B or 3 amperes, but on the other side of the screen, and they were leaning in. They weren't watching a victim. They were watching a storm gather beneath silk. They felt something tighten in their chest, not outrage, but understanding. The quiet devastation of being measured by appearance instead of merit, of earning a seat but being treated like an intruder. And Marion, dignified as ever, never lifted her voice. She didn't need to, because that notebook, that gaze, that unbearable restraint, it all pointed to one truth. She was not here by accident. She was here with purpose, and what was quietly recorded in that small leather book, it would not stay quiet for long. Long before she ever took seat 2 amperes, Marion Rice had walked these aisles in a navy blue uniform with pressed pleats and a name tag that too many passengers ignored. Back then, she wasn't the woman people bowed to in boardrooms or quoted in leadership seminars. She was the one who poured coffee with a steady hand while brushing off casual insults with a tighter smile. 25 years as a flight attendant taught her more about human nature than any law book ever would. She'd seen kindness bloom mid-flight, yes, but she'd also seen entitlement sharpen behind polite grins and subtle cruelty hide beneath expensive cologne. She never forgot the passenger who once waved her away like an annoyance when she tried to offer him a warm towel, or the woman who insisted she must have taken a wrong turn into first class. At the time, Marion held it in, folded it quietly into memory, just like her mother had taught her. Don't give them a reason, her mother used to say. You already walk into the room with 2 strikes. Keep your head high and your mouth closed. But as Marion aged, something shifted. Not her dignity that never left her, but her silence. It transformed, became intentional. She left the cabin not in shame, but in pursuit of something larger. Law school wasn't the escape. It was the weapon. Night classes, double shifts, a scholarship that came from sheer persistence. Marion earned every degree, every courtroom she stepped into. Her mind, once ignored at cruising altitude, became sought after in complex legal disputes. She carved space for herself where no one offered it, and when doors didn't open, she built new hallways. By the time she returned to the airline industry, it wasn't to serve drinks, it was to help run it. But today, on this flight, she wasn't here to be known. She was here to remember. To see how the people who wore the uniform she once respected would behave when they thought no one was watching. That's why she said nothing when Kendra's eyes glazed over her presence. That's why she didn't flinch when she was skipped for the second time. She observed with the stillness of someone who had sat through far worse than poor service. She wrote a single line in her notebook, not out of spite, but because she had learned the power of documenting the small things, the words, the tone, the tension that couldn't be captured on video, but lived in the silence between sentences. She had once watched a colleague get reassigned for speaking up. She'd seen complaints disappear into HR black holes and bad behavior rewarded with promotion. She knew better than to make a scene. Not yet. She had come to understand that some of the most effective revolutions begin in absolute quiet. The kind of quiet that studies, waits, plans. As she sat back in her seat, Marion didn't wear bitterness. She wore patience. She had felt this sting before racial assumptions wrapped in polite tones, the invisible question of whether she belonged. And though she had learned to rise above it, that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Because no matter how many times you experience something unjust, your soul never fully hardens to it. So when the attendant made that subtle slight, when the room around her chose polite silence over integrity, Marion didn't speak up because she needed validation. She stayed quiet because she was gathering the truth. And truth, once collected, doesn't disappear. It builds, it sharpens, and when it's ready, it rises. It started with a whisper, just a quiet word passed down the aisle, carried not by urgency but by strategy. David Lee, the building manager from Skylift headquarters, stepped forward with a strained smile and the kind of nervous energy that made the air feel heavier than the altitude. "Sophia," he said gently, though his tone was tight, "could I have a quick word with you in the galley?" It didn't sound like a request. Sophia Cruz, 24, bright-eyed and fresh from law school, froze. She blinked, then nodded, her movements hesitant, almost childlike. Around her, no one moved. No one said a thing. She stood and followed him, clutching her laptop like armor. Marion saw it all of a sudden hush, the way the other passengers in business class glanced up, then quickly away, as if pretending not to notice absolved them of complicity. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Sophia returned, pale and tight-lipped. She walked back to her seat like someone trying not to fall apart before reaching safety. Her steps were small, her breath shallow. Marion observed the way Sophia sat down slowly, trying not to draw attention, trying not to break. She didn't reach for her tablet again. She didn't touch her drink. She just sat there, silent and humiliated, eyes locked on a spot in the carpet that held no answers. Kendra was the first to speak. Of course she was. "Rough conversation, lady?" she asked, loud enough for 2 rows to hear. The false concern in her voice landed like a slap. Sophia didn't respond. Kendra didn't care. She walked away, smug and satisfied, having delivered her little sting. The implication was clear. Everyone had seen Sophia leave. Now they'd seen her return like a child caught cheating on a test. That was all it took. No facts, no proof, just a suggestion. A sensitive file had gone missing from the system, one that only a few people had access to. Someone had used Sophia's login. It didn't matter that she was the least likely person even to understand its full context, let alone leak it. She was the intern, the easiest to blame. She had no power, no voice, no safety net, and that made her the perfect scapegoat. Marion didn't ask questions. She wrote things down. The time Kendra made her remark, the exact phrasing David had used when speaking to the senior counsel. The way Rachel Steele, the corporate attorney, had looked away when Sophia returned. It wasn't guilt in Rachel's eyes. It was a calculation, like someone who had seen too many careers end with a whisper and didn't want to be next. Outside, the light was shifting. Dusk stretched long shadows across the cabin, and the hush that filled the air felt less like calm and more like avoidance. Marion closed her notebook slowly. Her eyes flicked to Sophia, who now looked smaller than she had an hour ago. Not physically, but in the way a soul contracts when cornered. Marion had seen this before. In law firms, in courtrooms, in back hallways where apologies were never given. This wasn't about a missing file. It was about hierarchy. About who was believed and who was disposable. Sophia wasn't guilty. She was just convenient. Marion knew the difference, and she wasn't done writing. The silence in the cabin had thickened. Not from turbulence, but from the weight of something quietly cruel. Sophia sat still, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her as if staring hard enough might make her disappear. David Lee had returned to his seat, composed on the surface, but with the rigid stiffness of a man who knew he'd made a misstep and was hoping no one would notice before the plane touched down. But someone had noticed. Marion Rice closed the small notebook on her lap with the same care one might close a case file after gathering enough to go to court. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She simply rose, turned slightly toward the aisle, and spoke in a voice so even it startled those who had tuned her out until now. "Mr. Lee, I believe there's been a mistake that needs to be addressed immediately." David turned, unsure if she was speaking to him. The others turned too. Marion didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The intern in question was on a company-sanctioned compliance call during the exact time your confidential file was accessed. That call was recorded. It included time-stamped logins, IP address tracking, and geolocation data that places her nowhere near the terminal your system flagged. If you review the metadata in the leaked file, you'll also see it was last downloaded onto a personal device registered under someone else's corporate ID, yours, or your assistant's to be precise. There was a pause, sharp and hanging in the air like an unfinished verdict. Kendra, halfway down the aisle, stopped moving. Rachel Steele, the company attorney, slowly lowered her phone and studied Marion for the first time, seeing her as something other than an unassuming passenger. David's throat moved as he swallowed, but he said nothing. "You're quoting contract language about data protection that I helped draft 5 years ago," Marion continued, her voice still calm, but now laced with a precision that cut like a scalpel, which tells me that you've either forgotten who wrote your policies or never bothered to read the version that was approved after your last security breach. Sophia lifted her head, confusion and disbelief flickering across her face. Marion turned slightly to meet her gaze and offered the faintest of nods, not of pity but of affirmation. You didn't do anything wrong. You were just the easiest to accuse. She looked back at David, her tone now wrapped in iron beneath velvet. I suggest you draft a formal apology to Miss Cruz before this flight lands. Not because you're afraid of being sued, but because it's the right thing to do. However, if that apology doesn't reach her inbox by the time we taxi, I'll be elevating this entire incident to Skylift's internal compliance board, along with the evidence. And you and I both know what that means. The only sounds now are the faint hum of the engines and the quiet shuffle of passengers pretending not to eavesdrop. But their eyes betrayed them. They were listening. They were watching. Marion returned to her seat without fanfare, her expression unreadable. But the power in her silence was unmistakable. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply stated the facts and left the weight of them to fall where it belonged. David didn't speak for the rest of the flight, but everyone else began to wonder who the woman in 2 amperes was. And they would soon find out. Something had shifted in the cabin. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for people to sit up straighter, to pretend they weren't listening while doing precisely that. Marion didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply returned to her seat, lifted her cup, and took one calm sip as if she'd just reminded someone to turn off the stove. But the tremor had already started, quiet but certain. David Lee hadn't spoken since. He sat frozen, staring at his phone like it might offer an escape route. A minute passed, then 2, then Sophia's phone buzzed. She blinked at the screen, hesitated, and slowly tacked it open. Her eyes moved back and forth as she read. Then she looked up, stunned. He apologized, she whispered. He copied HR, legal, and the board. It's all there. He cleared my name. Marion didn't look surprised. That's what integrity does, she said. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to arrive before the damage becomes irreversible. People started to whisper. The couple in 3B and 3C leaned toward each other. A man in row 4 took off his headphones. And Kendra kept her head down, pretending to count cups in the galley, though her hands shook with every touch. But the most stunning shift wasn't in what was said. It was in the way people now looked at Marion. No longer like background. No longer like someone out of place in a business seat. There was something regal in her silence now. The kind that doesn't demand respect, it evokes it. 10 minutes before landing, a senior flight supervisor appeared at the front of the cabin. He wasn't scheduled to be on this flight. His blazer crisp, his badge silver, and unmistakable Skylift operations. He walked straight to Marion and whispered, "May I speak with you briefly?" She rose without hesitation, following him to the galley where another figure waited, a woman in her 50s, holding a tablet, her face unreadable, but her stance respectful. On the screen was surveillance footage. Timestamp, undeniable. A man, David's assistant, is accessing the confidential file and forwarding it from his email, matching everything Marion had quietly said. "We've already initiated internal disciplinary action," the woman said. "Miss Cruz has been fully cleared. The board's been notified. We just thought you should know." Marion nodded. "I don't need credit, just accountability." The supervisor looked at her, unsure, then said quietly, "Would you consider advising our ethics restructuring panel? We need people who see things." Marion paused, eyes locked on his. "I'll think about it, but I don't do performative fixes. If you want real change, it starts with truth, especially when it's uncomfortable." When she returned to her seat, Sophia looked at her as if she were seeing her for the first time, not as the woman in simple slacks with a soft cardigan, but as someone who turned a moment of quiet humiliation into a mirror and made everyone look. The plane landed in silence. Not the bored kind, the kind that holds its breath. When the doors opened, people didn't push forward. They waited, not because of protocol, because Marion hadn't left yet. As she stepped toward the front, Kendra stood frozen near the cockpit. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but nothing came out. Marion paused. Not long, just enough. Choose your words carefully next time, she said gently, because sometimes one sentence costs more than a paycheck. Sometimes it breaks trust you never even saw being given. Then she walked down the jet bridge. Behind her, people didn't just whisper anymore. They watched. And in their silence was something Kendra had never expected, a reckoning she couldn't charm her way out of. The gate door hissed open. Marion stepped into the terminal with the quiet grace of someone used to both spotlights and shadows. She carried no briefcase, wore no flashy badge, just that same composed expression that had unnerved every person who had underestimated her over the past 6 hours. But what no one realized, at least not yet, was that the silence she carried wasn't passive. It was preparation. Across the gate, a Skylift employee in his 20s, adjusting a headset, glanced up from his tablet. His gaze locked on Marion. His jaw dropped. Oh my God. He didn't mean to say it out loud, but he did. People nearby turned to look. That's her. That's Marion Rice. She's the CEO. She owns the airline. It took only 5 seconds. And in those 5 seconds, the energy in the terminal shifted like a snapped cable under tension. Every whisper turned into a gasp. Someone fumbled their phone. A flight attendant who had ignored Marion's presence on board now stood frozen, her face draining of color. 2 business travelers from row 3 stopped mid-conversation. Wait, what? The woman had quietly requested coffee. The one Kendra had referred to as lady instead of ma'am. The one David Lee had tried to belittle with policy talk. That woman was the reason their paychecks existed. The hallway buzzed like a live wire. Someone repeated her name, this time with reverence. Marion Rice, CEO, co-founder of Skylift, former flight attendant, a legend in the industry. The woman who once served coffee and coach had just rewritten the entire story of what power looks like in first class. Inside the jet bridge, Kendra had just stepped off the plane. She looked up, confused by the cluster forming near the terminal glass. When she spotted Marion at the center of it, the look on her face flickered from confusion to horror. One of the supervisors standing by the exit moved forward, tablet in hand. Miss Rice, he roared so the surrounding crowd could hear. We're sincerely sorry you experienced this. The board has been informed, and we're launching a full investigation immediately. Marion turned her head slightly, offering only the barest nod. Then she looked toward Kendra, now frozen halfway between the aircraft and the terminal carpet, unsure whether to run or apologize. Marion's voice was calm, clear, heard by everyone within 20 feet. Sometimes, the people you judge in silence are the ones who hold the pen when your story ends. Choose your words carefully, Miss Whitlow. It hit like thunder in a library. Passengers from the flight, still gathering their bags, began clapping. It wasn't planned, it wasn't loud, but it was genuine. A wave of human relief. The justice they had dared not speak suddenly had a face, and that face was looking back at them with grace, not vengeance. A teenage girl recording on her phone whispered, "That's the realest thing I've ever seen." As an arranged you have episodes, a man in business class who hadn't said a word the whole flight murmured to his colleague, "I judged her too." David Lee, watching from a corner near the Skylift lounge entrance, felt the burn of truth settle across his neck like a collar too tight. His phone buzzed again. Board inquiry. Immediate response required. Too late. Marion walked forward not with triumph, but with purpose. Her silence had spoken. Her identity had landed, and every person who had doubted her was now standing in the weight of their reflection. And for the first time since the flight began, the world finally saw her. Marion didn't need applause. She didn't need press conferences or headlines to reclaim her place. The moment the truth of her identity rippled through the airport, a quiet reckoning began, not with shouting, but with a collective exhale, like everyone had been holding their breath and only now realized it. The next morning, Marion arrived at Skylift's headquarters, not through the front entrance where cameras sometimes lingered, but the same back hallway she'd walked 2 decades earlier when she was still in uniform, carrying coffee trays at training seminars. This time, the doors opened before she reached them. The executive team stood waiting. eyes were different now, less confident, more aware, not out of fear, but reflection. She took no seat at the head of the table. Instead, she walked to the center and stood, hands folded, voice even. I was always here, she said. You just weren't looking. No one spoke. For too long, we've allowed courtesy to depend on assumptions. Service tied to appearance. Respect offered on conditions. She reached into her bag and placed a thin folder on the table. It wasn't thick, but it felt heavy. These, she said, are stories I've collected over the years. From the ramp, the agents passed over. Women are told to smile instead of speak. From passengers who were told they didn't look like they belonged in row 2 amperes. Her voice didn't rise, but the truth inside it shook something loose. We cannot fix what we won't face. The silence in the room was no longer awkward. It was accountability, the kind that doesn't flinch. So Marion got to work not through orders, but through presence. She visited training centers unannounced. She stood in the break room with junior staff and asked, "What's not working?" She rewrote the reporting system to bypass bureaucratic shields. She formed a listening panel with no PR filter and told them, "Your job isn't to spin, it's to hear." Policies shifted. So did culture. Flight crews began noticing small changes. A regional manager in Phoenix who once ignored complaints was reassigned. A gate agent who'd written 5 bias reports without response now had them acknowledged and acted on. And through it all, Marion never once referred to the incident on Flight 182 inches public. She didn't have to. Everyone who'd seen it live or through a screen remembered the look in her eyes when Kendra asked if she was in the wrong seat. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet grief of someone who'd hoped the world had changed, then decided to change it herself. Weeks later, as she walked through a crowded terminal in Atlanta, a young crew member stopped her mid-step. "Ma'am," she said gently, "I used to think no one up there cared about us down here." Marion met her eyes and smiled. "Now you know someone always did." And just like that, she moved forward not as someone above the system, but someone reshaping it from within. 6 weeks later, the world had moved on. Viral stories have short lifespans, and Flight 182 was no longer a trending topic. But something strange had happened within the company. Something stayed, a shift that couldn't be undone. At Skylift's main terminal in San Francisco, staff no longer lowered their voices when speaking the truth. Gate agents looked passengers in the eye a little longer. Uniforms were worn with a touch more pride, not out of fear, but from a sense of belonging that hadn't been there before. It wasn't because Marion Rice gave a press conference. She didn't. She didn't need to. Her presence did the work. Quiet, grounded, constant. She showed up at the early briefings at 4:45 a.m., still in sneakers and a windbreaker, listening more than she spoke. She ate with janitors. She lingered at the baggage belt longer than she had to, just to understand, to see, to be seen. Leadership didn't come from the title. It came from the seat. And everyone now knew Marion had once sat in all of them. The corporate culture began to hum at a different frequency. HR no longer filtered complaints, they investigated them. Training sessions are no longer rushed through biased modules, they open up honest discussions. And people, ordinary people, began to trust that dignity was no longer a privilege. One evening, Marion walked alone through Terminal C in Dallas, the place where she had once been overlooked, called just a worker, mistaken for less. Her steps were steady now, not because of pride, but because of purpose. Near Gate 15, someone had installed a quote on the wall. She hadn't approved it, no one asked. But there it was, etched in brushed steel. You can't choose where people see you, but you can choose what they remember. Marion Rice. She smiled softly. Later that week, a reporter called again, eager for a final word. "After everything, Miss Rice, what would you say to the people who treated you like you didn't belong?" Marion paused, not to think, just to feel. "I don't want them to feel shame," she said slowly. "I want them to feel something more difficult. I want them to remember, because memory can change behavior, and behavior builds culture." "And to those watching who felt what you felt?" the reporter asked. She didn't blink. "You're not invisible," she said. "Even when the world fails to see you, don't stop seeing yourself." That line line, quietly delivered, became the most quoted moment of the interview. It wasn't outrage that lingered. It wasn't revenge. It was the grace of a woman who had endured enough to know that power doesn't mean control, it means responsibility. Marion didn't need to fire 100 people. She needed to awaken 1,000, and she had. This wasn't just a story about power. It was about perception, about how easy it is to dismiss someone based on how they look, and how wrong that can be. Marion Rice didn't shout, didn't seek revenge. She let the truth reveal itself, and in doing so, reminded us all that dignity isn't earned by title. It's owed to every human being. So we ask you, what would you have done on that flight? And what will you do the next time you witness a quiet injustice? If this story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that challenge how we see each other and how we choose to act when no one else does. Thank you for watching. Stay kind, stay human, stay awake.